Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. There's a lot of content we have to get to today, so let's jump into it. Welcome to Planning Drupal 7 End of Life at the Museum. I'm Doug Allen, a board member at MCN, and here to welcome you and introduce today's session. MCN is a nonprofit, volunteer-run professional organization committed to growing the digital capacity of museum professionals. MCN's developed a deep, active community engaged in year-round conversations, webinars, and resource sharing. As an MCN member, you can join special interest groups, participate in our mentorship program, and shape MCN's future and leadership roles, such as our SIG chairs, conference chairs, and time with us on the MCN board. If you aren't already a member, we hope you'll join us. You can learn more at mcn.edu. Also, I want to thank Microsoft, the Registration Assistance Fund sponsor, Axitel. Microsoft is the Registration Assistance Fund sponsor. Axiel is the Ignite sponsor, and all the other sponsors that are listed in the program for help making this conference possible. Today's session is a workshop, and we're going to be using the chat box for your questions. Please post your name in the chat box, and you'll be called upon so that you can ask your question. If you'd prefer not to ask, just type it into the chat box. Once again, this session is Planning for Drupal 7 End of Life at the Museum. Your presenter today is Alex Morrison, the Managing Director at Kyriakou, and he'll be joined by Matt Chapman and Ben Kyriakou, also with Kyriakou, who will be answering your content types that are questions. Alex, off to you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I am very pleased to run this session. I'm going to start sharing my screen and explain what we're going to do. If I can do that, let me just see if I can do that. Hang on. Right, let's see if I can do that. Right, okay, so do that. Right, can everyone see the screen? That work? Thank you. Right, yeah. Okay, let's go. So this session, we got an hour today to talk about something which I think is, for those affected, is going to be quite an important subject over the next year or two. So I just wanted to keep it fairly simple and to make it as open as possible for people to air their own thoughts and questions and to have this discussion here at MCN. The session is going to break down into three very simple sections. A quick introduction. I just introduce myself and my fellow presenters. Then I'm going to give you a bit of background on this whole subject. We've done a bunch of research, which I'll share with you to explain why this is an interesting issue. And then the most important part of the session, I think, will be the Q&A session. So I've pre-prepared a bunch of questions for Matt and Ben, and I'll take questions from participants as well, and hopefully we can have an interesting conversation that way. So let me just spin it on here. So my name is Alex Morrison, and I'm the Managing Director and founder of Kyriakou. We manage, run, help, support quite a large number of Drupal websites. So this subject is dear to our hearts, and we see that is a subject that's going to be important and interesting over the next few years for people. I'm here today with two of my colleagues. I run projects and manage the client relationships and do research and think about strategy. My two colleagues actually do the work of leading teams on the kind of projects that we're talking about today. So just briefly then, so my colleague Ben is here, Ben Kyriakou. Ben's worked with us for a long time now, leading projects working with Drupal. Ben, do you want to just say a bit about your background here?
Sure. So yeah, as Alex said, I've been working with Drupal for quite a long time now. I think the first Drupal site I interacted with was probably Drupal 5, which was very many years ago now. And yeah, recently, especially this year, have been working with Drupal 8 and specifically over the past 12 months or so, migrating some Drupal 7 sites to Drupal 8. So hopefully I can give you some pearls of wisdom from the experience there.
Thanks. And my next colleague is Matt. So Matt is, like Ben, a very experienced developer, leading teams, working on Drupal projects, and has deep experience of moving things from one, particularly Drupal 7 into Drupal 8. So Matt, do you just want to say a bit about
that? Yeah, much the same as Ben. I've been working with Drupal for a long time, probably since about Drupal 5. And over the last sort of 10 years, it's been the main constant in my career. And it's been either moving people onto Drupal 7 or Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 or moving across. But generally, Drupal has been a key part of the platform.
Thanks. Okay, so that's what we're bringing to this party, and the first part of what we're going to do is just to look at a presentation. I'll just give you the results of our research. So this is a separate presentation which I can share the link. You can have access to this. So I'll quickly zip through this. Hang on, how do I present it? Oh, there you go. So when I first heard about Drupal 7, Drupal 8, I thought, oh, okay, well, no big deal. And then I started to understand a bit more about what was involved, and realized that we needed to do quite a lot more research to find out what was going to happen here as Drupal 7 came to the end of its life. So I'll just give you the results of that before we go into the questions. I'll begin with an update. So Drupal 7 was due to go end of life in November 2021. Because of the pandemic and the impact that that's had on everybody, they've actually extended that. So the issue that we're talking about now has a terminus in November 2022, which is good news, obviously, in relation to the timing of everything in 2020. That feels like, okay, well, we can all relax. I think, depending on how you experience what I'm going to show you now, I think we'd argue that that's probably not right. While it has been delayed, and that's good because it gives us a bit more time to get our act together, it still means that if you're investing in a Drupal 7 website, then you're probably putting money into something that is not going to go very far. So best to get on and move to the future technology now. But let's come back to that question as we get into the questions. So just briefly then, here's some, talk a bit about Drupal at the museum, or why it's been good in the museum's world, then a bit about what's happening with Drupal 7, some of the issues around upgrading, and some of the possibilities that arise. So Drupal 7 has over time become a very strategic asset for a lot of museums and their online programs. And it's kind of unexpected that it would come to the end of its life in this way. And the way that this is happening, I think we would argue it really does need quite a strategic response. It's not just a kind of, oh, okay, well, just business as normal kind of event. It's actually much more interesting and potentially significant than that. And that's what this session is all about. If we look at Drupal itself, Drupal launched in 2001, so it's now 19 years old, I guess. It's been very, very successful, and I think the reasons I quoted here, it's very versatile, it's quite cleverly arranged, organized, it's open source, very importantly, it's incredibly widely supported, and it does a job. of providing kind of enterprise content management services to people who otherwise would have to spend a lot of money on buying a proprietary system. And it has all the advantages that open source has, and it's responded over many years to lots of demands that museums will recognize. And it's incredibly widely used, over 1 million websites. And those are not trivial things. So it's a big deal. Drupal 7 came out in 2011. It'll hit the buffers in 22. Drupal 8, funnily enough, came out in 2015 after much brouhaha. We remember waiting for it with bated breath. Funnily enough, that's coming to an end before Drupal 7 in November 2021, because for reasons I'll explain later. But the good news is that Drupal 8 is being replaced by Drupal 9, which is actually released in 2020, and seems to be a decent thing. So at least the upgrade path is secure. Why is Drupal in use at the museum? This was something that really surprised me when I dug into it. So there is a very helpful survey produced by the MIT Museum, and the link is in this slide, and I'll share this with you one way or another after this. But I did the analysis of, there were 148 listed websites, and of those, over a third were using Drupal. The next one down was WordPress, then Typo3, and the rest are just basically sort of tumbleweed. So it is really preeminent. It's literally twice as popular as the nearest competitor, WordPress, and there are reasons for that. Why is that? Well, it's open source and widely supported, and it's based on the most common and most popular and best established open source frameworks, so Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. It's got very good security against hacks, which people care about. A lot of our clients, we deal with Arabic websites, Yiddish websites, all sorts of multilingual content. And it's got very good support for multilingual stuff. It's got good support for version control and software. So if you're doing a sort of enterprise project using a content management system, you really need this kind of facility. And many more lightweight content management systems simply don't have this, which would make developing a large project in their framework much more difficult than it is in Drupal. So that's often a key consideration in the decision. It's got lots of support for integration with other systems. So again, because it's so widely adopted and because it plays such an important role for many organizations, there are integrations with all sorts of other things that people care about. And it's got really good facilities for scale. And in the case of museums, lots of rich content. So it can handle museum collections and all the things that museums care about. And it integrates well with complex search and all the things that you might do with Solar or Elasticsearch all fit well within a Drupal framework, which again is not universally true. If you're thinking about alternatives, as we said, it's twice as popular as the most popular alternative, which is WordPress. WordPress is still, I think, primarily aimed at smaller websites. We've never been fans, though I know other people are. If we were looking at alternatives, we'd be looking possibly at Craft CMS, which we've used on a few things and we like a lot, but it's not open source and it does have limitations. I'm not sure that it would be suitable for a huge corporate project. Typo3 is up there with WordPress in popularity. All we know about Typo3 is we recently moved somebody off Typo3 onto Drupal 8 and they were really keen to move. That may be a one-off experience, but it seemed indicative to us, and we certainly didn't see any reason to love it particularly. And all the other systems are just used by a tiny minority. So Drupal is far from perfect. Anybody who's used it knows that it's got all sorts of complications it's gnarly and awkward. But if you need the features described above and you need it to be open source, then it's hard to see that there are many better alternatives. So obviously it's worth considering this question, but you may go around that bush and still come back and say, well, actually, no, we do still need to use Drupal. So with that preamble, then Drupal, let's have a look at the Drupal 7, Drupal 8, Drupal 9 sequence. So Drupal 7 was a major improvement over earlier versions. It was a big change from 5 and 6, which many people started using. It's been very successful, but the underlying components and the software architecture have been overtaken. So it's not organized in the way that a modern web software project would be organized, particularly with respect to the sort of object-oriented programming paradigm, which is extremely powerful and useful. There's an article which is linked here, which explains a bit more about that. So, in particular, that when they moved to Drupal 8, they wanted to make it a big paradigm shift, and this is where a lot of the advantages of moving from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 come in, but also where a lot of the complication comes in. So Drupal 7 was obviously introduced before widespread need to produce responsive websites, and that has made an enormous difference, hasn't it, in terms of the complication of building high-end, lovely websites of the sort that museums need and want. Drupal 8 really reflects that, but in order to do that, in order to really kind of embrace the modern web environment, it's made a shift to a truly object-oriented architecture, and changed the basis of its underlying technology into two of the leading web development frameworks, which is respectively Symfony and Twig. So Symfony is the fundamental software development framework. It's sort of been an alternative to, say, Laravel, if you're familiar with those things. Twig is the templating system. Previously, Drupal had its own templating system. They're now using a third-party system called Twig, which is actually really nice. It's the same one that's used in Craft and others. So these are the major players in this. So in a sense, Drupal 8 has aligned itself with the rest of the industry. Symfony is as preeminent in its world as Drupal is in the museum's world that I've just talked about, and Twig ditto. There are alternatives, sure, but these are absolutely industry standard bits of kit, and they do absolutely align with what people think should be used for modern web development. So that's the thing. We're moving into these two completely new technologies, and that's then making the shift from 7 to 8 a very big deal. So it means you've got to convert in moving from 7 to 8, you've got to convert everything to work in accordance with Symfony under the hood and with Twig for the front end templating. So essentially, you've got to rebuild your front end, and you've got to rework your back end. And it's not a sort of push button process by any means. We talked about Drupal 8 going to Drupal 9. It's a funny thing that it's called, that it's a whole number shift, because in many ways it's not a very big deal. But the reason that they're calling it a move from 8 to 9 is because it corresponds with the change in this underlying software platform called Symfony. And there are breaking changes between Symfony 3.x and the newer Symfony 4. So they couldn't just keep it as Drupal 8. But actually moving from Drupal 8 to 9, as Matt and Ben can tell you in more detail, that's really not a big deal. It's the 7 to 8 shift that is the big deal. And because of these changes that they've made to put themselves on top of Symfony and Twig, it gives them a roadmap which is very secure and it's easy to anticipate. So they're just going to move in lockstep with the rest of the industry as Symfony and Twig enhance themselves. And that it's unlikely that in the foreseeable future there would be any similar architectural change in Drupal as there is now between 7 and 8. If we look at the benefits of Drupal 9, because nobody's going to be using Drupal 8 very much longer, benefits of Drupal 9, you get better support for new technologies. So this is a whole thing about modern responsive websites. The experience for content editors is a bit better. I would say that this has never been a good feature of Drupal, and it's still far from ideal, but it is a bit better. The performance for end users is going to be better. It'll be faster and more responsive. Ongoing long-term support and it's a clear forward path, and all the trimmings that go with that. So you do get positives. If you don't want to upgrade, so clearly what we're saying, and we can talk about this in more detail in the Q&A session, moving from 7 to 8 is a big deal, and it's going to take quite a while, and it's going to cost quite a bunch of money. So if you don't want to spend that, what's your option? Well, either you can move from Drupal 7 to something else, well, that's going to be a big deal also, or you can stick with Drupal 7. Now, if you don't have a very ambitious development program, then that may be something that works for you. And with Drupal 6, there was a long-term support program. People can pay, and they'll get updates to Drupal 6, which include security updates and so forth. There is a plan to put something like that in place for Drupal 7, and I'd be very confident that would be possible. But of course, it locks you into something that sooner or later you're going to want to get out of, and which will not be a hugely productive platform for large-scale or long-term development. But it is feasible. So if you've got a website that isn't going anywhere very much, or that you don't have the budget to improve anytime soon, then you can pay a relatively small amount of money probably, and keep it with Drupal 7 and get the benefits of security and so on. It has to be said that arrangements for this are not yet finalized. So I'm talking about something that will exist in theory. And I can't see why it wouldn't exist. There's going to be too much market demand. But it's fair to say that the arrangements aren't actually in place yet. That's just saying what I've just said, that there is a bunch of support going to be provided for Drupal 7. And yeah, on what commercial terms, it's not yet clear. So they're possibly going to rebrand it as Drupal Classic, but we don't know about that yet. What's involved in upgrading from Drupal 7? We can talk about this in more detail in a minute. We support 4 of these things. We've started work on migrating from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9, and Matt and Ben have been involved in some of those projects. So one of the projects, so we've got a fairly substantial website for a medium-sized cultural organization. They've got 158 different bits of that website are going to need to be reworked in one way or another, and all the front-end code is going to need to be reworked. There are some tools for migrating, and again, Ben in particular has good experience of this, content migration and so forth, but the scope is quite limited. In our opinion, and again, we can talk about this, if it's a large website, and presumably it's a large website because you're doing this in the first place, allowing less than 6 months is going to be pretty tight, depending on the size of your team and their ability. But if you extrapolate back from that, if you want to hit the November 22 deadline, then you're going to have to start in May 2022 at the absolute latest. But the earliest start date is now. You could get on with this now. Starting earlier is going to be advantageous, because if you're still fiddling with your Drupal 7 site, then that work is going to then need to be migrated, and that's fundamentally slightly wasted. But also, because this is a big thing, because it's Drupal, developer resources are not that thick on the ground. So if you're relying on being able to hire a large team to do Drupal work quickly, then you may be disappointed if you wait too long. How much effort? Yeah, we're still working on our the flagship 7 to 8 project, and we can talk a bit about this. An equivalent project we worked on took about 290 person days, so it's really quite a lot of time. And these things are quite difficult to estimate because it's all fiddly and the devil is in the detail. But a preliminary survey can give you an idea of the scale of the challenge. We'll talk a bit about how we did that and how we go about doing that. Opportunities. So if you are going to go down this route, then you've got some good opportunities. Never let a good crisis go to waste. All that. So you can revisit the way you organize your content. Drupal 8 and 9 do have better alternatives, particularly for pages, the way the page content is organized in a website. You can improve your editor experience, which is always a good thing. I think it's much neglected in web development. And then the user interface, Twig, is really good and should be a good upgrade, and you should be able to think in relation to that upgraded project. You should be able to look at the interface and come out with something that would be a better version of what you've got now. Since you're going to have to rebuild it anyway, you might as well. So here's the summary, just very briefly. All these things are going to need to be upgraded or replatformed sooner or later. Ideally, you do it in time for the deadline. Seems unlikely that deadline will be extended, but I suppose it could be. And you've got to, if you're not going to do that, then you need to think about how you're going to get support. In terms of alternatives, it's obviously worth thinking about what the alternatives to Drupal might be, but we're not sitting here thinking, oh no, there really are lots and lots of other good ones for the majority of Drupal websites. And the new versions are perfectly good, and they do have a long-term future, so that's reassuring. And having said all that, if you are going to do that upgrade, then it's a major project. It's not a couple of weeks work. And at the very least, if you're going to have to obtain a budget, then planning needs to start as soon as possible. Because if you say you've got to start in May 22, then you've got to get a budget for that. Depending on your budget cycles, you may need to start. You may need to have a considerable run up in order to acquire the necessary resources. So that's the context. That's why, because of this research, some of which at least was quite a surprise to us when we did it much earlier this year. That's why we set up this workshop, because we felt that people really need to understand about this and get onto it. So I'm now going to go into the Q&A session. I'll skip this bit. Hang on. How can I get out of this? So let's go back. So right, okay. So I've got some questions that I've pre-prepared here. I'm going to have a quick look in the, there's a Q&A, hang on, how does that work? No, that's not right. Sorry, what I need to do is I need to look in the chat. Hang on.
I don't think we've got any questions in the Zoom chat yet, as far as I can see, but correct me, our hosts, if I'm wrong. So yeah, I think Alex, plow ahead with
Okay, all right.
questions.
Oh, blimey, sorry. Right. So, all right, let's take that. So, I'm going to ask these questions to Matt and Ben. I've got the chat is now. Right. Oh, and there's a new message. Oh, Tina. Okay, Tina, you've got a question. Can you type it up or speak it?
Sure.
Oh, hi.
Can you
Tina.
hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Sorry if I missed this, but do you recommend going from Drupal 7 to 8 and then 9, or Drupal 7 to 9?
So currently, and I'll let Matt speak for himself, but I would say my recommendation would be to go to 7 to 8 and then to 9. Partly that is a sort of at this moment in time recommendation because Drupal 8 is still much more mature than Drupal 9 is. Drupal 9 has only been put into stable release recently. And in the experience I've had trying it out, there are still some things that aren't entirely up to date, both in terms of kind of contrib modules and some supporting infrastructure. And as Alex said, we don't anticipate moving a site from Drupal 8 to Drupal 9 to be particularly onerous, as long as you haven't written a Drupal 8 site that for some reason is using loads of deprecated code for Drupal 9, which is quite hard to do. And it shouldn't really be that much more effort than just doing a point release. So I would say 7 to 8, then 8 to 9, but I'll let Matt weigh in with his own opinion.
We probably wouldn't be doing our upgrade until next year. So maybe April, May. And from what I was reading, it seemed like that was the recommendation before, but now I think on the Drupal site, they were saying you can go from 7 to 9. There are some instructions because the difference between 8 and 9 won't be too big, right? But yeah, I'm just wondering.
Matt, do you want to comment?
Yeah, so no, you're correct in what you've read there. The upgrade from 8 to 9 will, for the most part, be trivial. The reason it would be better to go straight to 8 first is the same reason that blocked a lot of people from moving to Drupal 8 when it first came out. I think Drupal 8's adoption probably didn't start going up for maybe 1 to 2 years after it was released. The reason you probably not move straight to Drupal 9 is the availability of any contributed code, any contributed modules, plugins, extensions that you would need. I think there are some that still aren't. There are none that spring to mind, but I know there's one that I've seen in this last week that still hasn't been marked as Drupal 9 ready. And the other thing to note is there are tools available when you're building a Drupal 8 site that will say, hang on a second, you shouldn't be doing this because this will be incompatible with Drupal 9. Like Ben said, you get notifications for a substantial amount of deprecated code. So an agency or a partner who is helping move to Drupal 8 and to Drupal 9 will hopefully be able to make that, to ensure that the transition to 9 is painless. And ultimately a transition from 8 to 9, if that's taken into account, could be 1 to 2 hours with the smoother upgrade path between the major versions. So yeah, sorry, that's a long way of me saying yes, 8 to then 9 at the moment. But like you said, when it comes to May next year, that may have changed. And I think that ultimately it will come down to the audits of any existing sites and the audits of any custom code or contributed code that would be needed on a new site.
I think that's a good moment to have that conversation. So it's about planning for a Drupal 7 upgrade project. So Ben, do you want to just talk about how we've gone about that? Because I think that was, again, something that we discovered how to do.
Sure, yeah. So as Matt's touched on there, one of the major factors right now when you're planning out a migration is the level of contrib support. So when we say contrib, this is a very Drupal-y term, basically the kind of modules that you download from Drupal.org that someone's already written contrib, as opposed to, say, custom code where it's code you've written, or core code, which is stuff that comes prepackaged with Drupal. That is something that we've done as a first step with all of the sites we've migrated, and has been very useful because it will immediately flag up where modules either don't have support or just don't exist. So a kind of good example from our perspective, because this is something that a lot of sites use, is search. In Drupal 8, Search API, which was a Drupal 7 search module, is the canonical search solution for Drupal 8 now, and other modules that you may have used in Drupal 7, such as Apache Solr or Sarnia, do not exist in Drupal 8, or at least don't exist as the same modules. So factors like that are going to be the kinds of things, actually there's a question about it in the chat as well, the kinds of things that will immediately start to increase your cost of migration. You know, if you do a module audit and you have a column for, does this module have a Drupal 8 version, and you see lots of ticks in that column, that's probably a good sign that your migration is going to be less complex. If you do that audit and you see lots of crosses in that column, or you see lots of custom code in that column, then you're starting to kind of increase the cost of your migration. Matt, do you want to jump in on that? Do you have any extra?
No, I mean, without touching on the front end, which I know we've got down as a discussion point later on, I think that pretty much covers it.
So Ben, just apart from looking at the contrib modules, what else did you look at when you came to do the survey for the recent project that we've been working on?
So, like I said, I think the kind of the easy bit is, are these modules supported? The custom code is another big one, because if you're writing custom modules, obviously that code is going to have to come over to Drupal 8. There are some tools to help you with that. As Matt said, definitely one of the things that if you're a developer, you will want to have running alongside all your regular linting and things is the Drupal 9 support tool, so that while you're writing code for Drupal 8, it will just double check that you're not using anything that's marked for deprecation in Drupal 9. Like I say, those things are generally few and far between, so that's probably not a problem you're going to hit a lot, but worth making sure it's not a problem at all. And that's one of the bits where it's somewhat tricky to say how long that's going to take you, because really it depends on how much custom code you have. Obviously, more lines of code equals more time. And it's also going to depend for either you or your development team how familiar you are with Drupal 8, because it is a big shift from Drupal 7 APIs to Drupal 8 APIs. There are some things that will carry over fairly unchanged, but there are also a lot of things that will effectively need completely rewriting. And that is another thing to be aware of, is certainly if you have, if you are a developer or you have in-house developers, there's a sort of preliminary step to all of this, which is learning Drupal 8, because as Matt said, this is not, like 5 to 6 or even 6 to 7. It's a whole new ball game in many ways, and there's some learning to do. Matt, do you want to talk a bit about the kind of front end and how you might audit that? That's a bit that I'm not so hot on.
The problems we've had with the front end, and is that Drupal 7 was very, and Drupal 6 as well, was very restrictive, let's say, in the way that it allowed you to do front end development. There were a lot of things that you couldn't do. There were a lot of things that were difficult to do. And with Drupal 8, that's not a problem. If you've got an experienced front end developer writing the best possible markup they can, you can use it. That will be fine. So I think from a front end perspective, again, it just comes down to an audit of individual components on the site and this, that, and the other. And the only thing to really bear in mind would be that the markup given to you from Drupal 8 is not the same as the markup given to you in Drupal 7. And this was a big sticking point when we were looking into things like this, and past agencies where we've had the same thing, is that it was quite difficult to explain how you can't just sort of take the old front end and drop it onto the new site. But again, it comes down to what Ben said. There's deprecated functionality, there's changed functionality. Ultimately, it is for the better. And I mean, when we get down to the front end tips section, I may explain it a little bit more in depth, but we've got a relatively well proven way that kind of removes a lot of the hurdles from updating the front end of the Drupal site, which is basically removing Drupal 8 from the equation for a sizable chunk of the development, not going headless, but I'll explain a bit more in depth later on.
So there's a question in the chat about cost, and I think the answer to cost is obviously it will depend. It will depend on three things. It'll depend on how complicated your existing site is. It'll depend on how long, therefore, that work is going to take, and then it'll depend on at what rate you're buying the work, or whether you're able to do it in-house. All we can say, I think, is that the best way to shine a light on this is by doing an audit. So rather, you just can't look at a big and hairy website and say, oh, that's going to cost you this much money or take this much time. But there are ways, and we've sort of sketched these out a tiny bit in the chat so far. There are ways of doing an audit which can certainly throw some light on it, and we're busy as fast as we can acquiring knowledge of doing this on existing projects, so that when we come to answer that question again for the next clients, that we'll be able to give a much more definitive answer. But the key message, I think, is this isn't something that's going to come out of regular maintenance budgets. This is a much bigger project. It'll have to be funded on a one-off basis, and one would hope that it wouldn't be the same cost as redeveloping the website, but it's certainly going to be order of magnitude that amount of money. It might be somewhere between half and the whole amount. But it also depends clearly on how much you're going to take advantage of the opportunities that arise. So it's one thing to do a kind of screen for screen rebuild, and just accept that you'll take whatever benefits you can as you go, and another would be to do a more thoroughgoing thing. So actually, well, no, we can rethink the front end here, because that's the opportunity with Drupal 8. So there'll be a base cost below which you ain't going to be able to manage, and that's going to be a substantial cost for a big website. But then you can imagine then adding some extra resource and budget, and getting something which might be substantially better in the process. But in all cases, you're only going to be able to get a handle really on the budget question by doing a preliminary survey.
Just to jump in on the planning there as well, Alex, to stress the importance of good planning with an example is also being able to plan and look at features that perhaps don't get used on your existing sites, that perhaps you don't want to rebuild. As an example, I've worked in the last about 2 years ago with a large football club in the UK who, after the planning of the site, saved, I think it was double figures in the thousands of pounds. It was 10 or 20,000 pounds by auditing their site, planning their site, and going, hang on, nobody uses this, or not very many people use this. It's not worth the outset, the outlying cost. So I think planning a plan shouldn't necessarily just be how to transition. It should also be a plan for, do we need feature parity between our old site and our new site, or have our business goals have our cultural goals changed, business goals changed over the last N years that we've had this existing site?
Definitely, and I think that's maybe a level of audit that I skimmed over a bit, but that I should touch on is, once you've done that high level audit of module by module, theme by theme, then also looking at your content types, your blocks, things like that, the actual elements of the system is also worth doing. And as Matt said, that can then potentially flush out things where you look at your content types and say, actually, we made these 3 content types. They're basically just the same thing, but they've got one slightly different field. Maybe we simplify that and make it into a single content type. Maybe we don't need all of these taxonomies that we made over here for some project that we did a few years ago and now we're not using. So that's definitely a good way to find that dead wood. I would definitely suggest automating that as much as possible if you don't already have that information. And I wrote a small tool called Content Outline. There's a sort of very early version of that up on Drupal.org now, which you're welcome to try out. And I did that because I didn't want to have to go through every single content type and list out all the fields. So it gives you a kind of breakdown of what content types you have and what fields they've got and all of your blocks and views and things like that. And this, I'm going to seamlessly segue now into Sarah's question about how long an audit would take. Because it really comes down to how much you've got in the site. I would say in terms of scale, we're talking days rather than hours, but probably not weeks. You can take this a very long way, and when we've done this, the initial audit has been very much on the module kind of content type building block level. Because we've done these projects in an agile way, sometimes when we get to specific stories, so for example, if we're working through custom code and custom modules, then we might break that down even more into the level of specific features, specific functions and bits of code. But I would say for an initial audit of the site, it's going to be in the scope of days, depending on how much you've got to audit and how far you have to take that, really.
Can I move on to another question that Roger asked in the chat earlier? So what about alternative architectures? Clearly Drupal now supports different ideas about how a website might be organized. So question like headless Drupal, things like that. So Matt, Ben, do you have any thoughts on those sort of possibilities?
I'm on the fence with headless Drupal. However, I do like the idea of static sites. They remove a lot of the complexity from the front end, and they're also, because of the very nature of what they are, they're a lot more secure because you're not exposing your PHP site to the world. There are alternatives to Drupal in that respect. Drupal may or may not be the best tool for that. I couldn't give a definitive answer, I'm afraid. I would strongly recommend against Gatsby with headless Drupal, because in my experience, building the Gatsby site has tended to crash Drupal because it tries to do things too quickly. But it's a definite avenue that we could take. It's one that I've been thinking about for one of our existing projects to do partial headless. But the other thing is for a lot of museum sites, they have quite large collections, which doing with the static site isn't particularly. It doesn't lend itself very well to a site which is built by crawling content. If you've got 100 or 200 collection objects, that's fine. If you've got 1,000, if you've got 2,000, it starts to slow down very quickly, and all of a sudden you want to make one text change to one item and you've got to wait an hour for the content to rebuild. So there's that. Other options, things like headless Drupal with something like React or Vue. I've done that before. It's okay. The main problem you've got there is that you are, in my opinion, kind of abusing the web platform. You're building your website on the most fragile part of the web in JavaScript. So you do run the risk of your entire site breaking for no good reason. And it also means that a lot of people can't access the site, especially people in rural areas, which may be more of an issue in rural areas in the States. I'm not completely sure what the general internet connectivity is like in rural areas in the States. But you do risk limiting the amount of people that can see your site.
I was impressed, Ben, Matt rather, with the stuff you showed me using Fractal as a way to develop the front end. Do you just want to say a bit about that? Because that did seem to be a really positive development.
So yeah, this was what I was alluding to when I mentioned about decoupling the front end from Drupal in a way. And what I didn't mean by that was we run headless Drupal. We developed the front end for a Drupal site separately in a tool called Fractal, which I used at a previous agency and liked so much that I ended up becoming one of the maintainers of it. So I'd say that to front load my potential bias towards it. But ultimately what it means is we do the front end in a completely different tool. We do the front end in a tool called Fractal. And you don't need to know Drupal to use this tool. And this benefits us because we've got some front-end developers who are at the moment learning Drupal, who are very, very skilled front-end developers, but have not had the exposure to Drupal that perhaps someone like myself, Ben, or some of the other developers at CogUp have had. And what this means is they don't have to learn Drupal before they can start delivering value on a project. Our developer has built maybe Ben on the current project that Ben and I are working on, maybe a third of the core components for the Drupal site, and she hasn't had to touch Drupal yet, which I think is going well. It is going well, and then with the flexibility that Drupal 8 offers us, someone who's got more Drupal experience can look at the markup that Emily has written. I think Emily may be in the audience, so I would say wave if we were in person, but that's going to be useless now. We could look at the markups and the styles that Emily has done for us, and then someone with a bit more Drupal experience can go, right, this is the best way to integrate this into Drupal 8, and I can go off and make some twig templates, and Ben can go into the views that he's building and Drupalize the markup required. And all the time this is going on, Emily is using her more advanced front-end skills to go and build out the next thing using the minimum markup possible, properly accessible semantic markup, and she's not letting Drupal get in the way. Now this is something that we couldn't do with Drupal 7. It was we tried it in various ways. It was practically impossible because you needed to know exactly how Drupal worked. With Drupal 8 you don't have that problem. The other thing this means is that on the site that we're building, if there is any scope for a microsite, for example, that needs to look the same, but perhaps there's a different technology behind it. Perhaps it's a Slim Symfony project or a Node thing or a React thing. We can reuse those styles without having to involve Drupal in the mix, because all we need to do is grab the CSS files that have come from Emily's Fractal work and just drop them into a new site. So that's what I was talking about with the slightly different workflow that we've taken on the front end. So I've just seen Emily saying hello in this channel, made me smile. That we've got people who are learning Drupal for the very first time, who have hit the ground running on day one on an upgrade project and have been able to deliver value from the offset, which is something that we've never ever been able to do up to this point. I think historically on Drupal 7 projects that I've worked on, when I've been doing the front end or the back end, the front end has generally started 2 weeks to a month behind, maybe 1 sprint, 2 sprints behind if you're working in a Scrum fashion. And we've not had to do that now, which is great. And this front end is now portable. Like I said, we can move it to A, to B, to C.
Thanks.
Well, while we're talking about approaches, I just want to jump in quickly while it's at the forefront of my mind. So obviously we're talking about migrating, to Drupal and other systems and how you might do that. But we are talking about this from the perspective of this is a site that we're currently using and that we currently care about. And I know there are potentially people out there who have Drupal 7 sites that they're still maintaining, but they don't really touch the CMS side. So I do want to propose that there's another solution potentially here, which is flattening your site and just making it all static, which is something that we have done in the past for clients. I'm not sure if we've done it for anyone recently, but that is an option if you're thinking, oh no, I've got a Drupal site, I don't want it to go out of I don't want it to go out of security support, get my words in order, but I don't actually need the CMS functionality. Is there are lots of tools out there that will just create you a static copy of that site. You can stick it up on some cheap hosting somewhere and never have to worry about the security side. Or yeah, you could build it in MS Word, or I hear Front Page is still quite popular. So there are other options out there if it's not a site you necessarily care about right now, but you don't want to have to deal with security implications.
I've just put a link in the chat for the briefing presentation that I gave earlier before we got to the Q&A session. Tina observes quite rightly in the chat that flattening is hard for sites with lots of interactive components and custom code. Yeah, it's absolutely true. But if it doesn't have that, then as Ben says, that it can be an option. Yeah, it will depend on the site. So really, I think anyone who's involved in this in whatever way, the sooner you can start looking at what's involved, do the kind of module audit and review that Ben and Matt described earlier, and consider your options. The better, really, and then the path can become clear as a result of that. We're now at 6:29 in my time zone. I guess that's probably 1:29 in yours. For those of you on the East Coast. Are there any other final questions quickly? Put them in the chat. I'd just like to thank everybody for coming. It's been really good. I'm around on the various Slack channels on MCN. So we're happy to continue this conversation via that. That'd be great. It's been really interesting for us. Yeah, thanks so much. Onward.